Hey everybody. So this week we are diving into the concept of infrastructure in media culture and identity. So we're thinking about how media theorists of the last 10 years began to use the concept of infrastructure as a key framework for being able to articulate the various relationalities, the various effects, forms of labor, that all go into the different mediated spaces that we navigate. So prior to the last decade or so, we saw the term telecommunications network being a preferred term for, articulating the, contours and dynamics of mediated spaces. Yet not only, that term feels a little bit dated now, it didn't necessarily capture the expansiveness and the magnitude of our contemporary mediated spaces, and didn't help us think through all of the forms of work that mediated spaces are doing today, and how we understand them. So infrastructure brings with it a kind of attention to the various modes of organization that go into mediated spaces. So, modes of organization in the sense of, how our relationships are organized, how our experiences are organized, how our understandings of things like social difference are organized by mediated spaces. So, infrastructure really helps us, think through those various qualities of mediated spaces. And we're also thinking this week about how labor factors into mediated spaces in the sense of, we all put a great deal of work into sustaining the infrastructures that we navigate on a daily basis. So thinking about the work that we put into platforms like Facebook or Instagram, etc., and considering the ways that that work for a long time has not been considered necessarily under the umbrella of labor. So considering it's not a form of labor that's necessarily waged, it was difficult for media theorists to articulate, and it continues to be difficult for media theorists to articulate how do we understand that labor. So we're thinking about how the various forms of information, the various forms of work that we put into digital spaces through just navigating them and making connections, using them on a daily basis. How do we understand that as work? How do we understand that as labor? So some of the media theorists that Lisa Parks mentions in the excerpt from Keywords for Media Studies are folks like Mauricio Lazzarato, as well as, Tiziana Terranova. And, in thinking about those particular media theorists, identify the labor that we put into mediated spaces as occupying a complicated space of enjoyment and exploitation. So Tiziana Terranova notes that the labor that we put into mediated spaces, it's obviously enjoyable in the sense that we like making connections, we like engaging with these spaces, but it also functions to be an exploitative mechanism for the various data extraction models that are so prevalent for digital companies today. So thinking about how all of those factors go into how we conceptualize infrastructures and how that's going to guide us in this conversation today. So one of our authors for this week, Safiya Noble, wrote what is now, emerging as a very fundamental media studies text called Algorithms of Oppression. And in this text, we're thinking about the introduction that I ask you to look at, where she really, lays out her argument. And she's thinking about how, factors like algorithms and big data and all of these characteristics of the infrastructures that we navigate are often considered to be, benign or objective, in the sense that they're not understood as having any kind of a political bent. they're not understood as, being infused with any form of bias. Yet she makes the argument that those who craft algorithms, those who curate big data, and develop the mechanisms for, extracting data and whatnot, all of those people have their own biases. They have their own blind spots when it comes to, how privilege is impacting them and their perspective. So she's essentially making this argument that algorithms, big data, etc., we can't necessarily understand those factors of our, mediated experiences as being, holistically benign or objective. So we're thinking about how, with her argument and considering the ways that infrastructures reinforce different social inequities, she brings up this concept of technological redlining as a way of, elucidating this notion of how, algorithms, big data, etc., are not, benign or objective. So she's thinking about how, when we consider the traditional conceptions of redlining, we tend to think about it as face-to-face discrimination. And redlining, of course, would refer to, the various, in a classical sense, would refer to the various ways that, a banker sitting across from, a Black or Latino family denies them a small business loan, denies them a mortgage, just simply because they are intentionally, trying to keep them out of a particular neighborhood, intentionally trying to keep them from having a business in a particular area or having a business generally. So redlining has for years operated in this way, that, it's been a gatekeeping mechanism, and it's served to reinforce different forms of social inequity. Yet, Safiya Noble notes that technological redlining today functions as, the ways that, big data is extracted and manipulated. So we see, for instance, various financial institutions, using different models of, data gathering, data extraction to, go into folks' different, social media networks and essentially determine if there's enough people in that person's social media networks that are considered, a credit risk, that they would not offer someone an opportunity based on, the various folks that are in their social media networks. My dog is trying to get into the room right now. So thinking about how, Safiya Noble pioneered this concept of technological redlining, and it can be applied to, various mechanisms within mediated spaces where data is used in ways that reinforce different forms of social inequity. And Safiya Noble is also interested in the ways that, big data companies, big media companies like Google, like Facebook and whatnot, they have for many years been considered this public good, a holistic public good, in the sense that they offer some kind of a public utility. Yet both Safiya Noble and Lisa Parks, in her piece, they discuss the ways that we need to really complicate our understandings of what purpose, entities like Google play when it comes to offering public utilities, because we see a shift now to the public then functioning as a utility for the company. So the public then being positioned in this way that, they are, having, various data extracted from them. So how do we make sense of that, and how, Safiya Noble is posing the question of how do we challenge that, and, proposes breaking up various, corporate monopolies, which, we can talk on the discussion board if folks see that as a viable option, if that is necessarily what you see as, a viable response or answer to this pressing issue. So, thinking about how, moving into the other short pieces that we were looking at for this week, infrastructure then plays a metaphorical role in, the other pieces where we see John Scalzi, and he takes up the concept of infrastructure in an interesting way by looking at how gaming language can be used metaphorically to help folks understand privilege. So he's basically taking up how various the infrastructures of video games can help people understand the ways that privilege operates. So he uses this analytic to help his readers, who are primarily male gamers, help them understand what privilege looks like, and says, imagine that you are engaging in a video game on the lowest difficulty setting. You don't have many barriers exposed to you. You don't have, various non-players in the game trying to, prevent you from going to an elevated status in the game and whatnot. And is basically, making this argument that we can understand privilege as, being this low difficulty setting, as we would through gaming language. And Lisa Nakamura, who's another key media theorist that we're looking at this week, she sees that there is a great power in helping folks understand privilege through, using the game space and the structure of a game space as a metaphor to help them understand it. But she's worried that that helps abstract the understanding of privilege, in the sense that, if you're using and taking up gaming language to help folks understand privilege, then you're essentially positioning the concept of privilege as being this sort of nebulous, faraway set of structural benefits that you're not engaging within your interpersonal interactions on a daily basis. So she's essentially making this argument that we can understand privilege as being something that is taking place in an ongoing way through our interpersonal interactions, and with that there's a great power in how we can challenge it and leverage it to produce various forms of social change. So there's a lot of different dimensions of how to understand infrastructures, mediated infrastructures, this week, and we'll talk about some of these concepts and break them down more on the discussion board. So I look forward to that.